Hello, I'm Anthony DaBruzzi. Thank you so much for joining us as we try to make sense of the state's new legislative maps. If you haven't given these political boundaries a whole lot of thought before, well, you're not alone. But they matter because they play a role in who represents you in Madison. You're going to hear the word gerrymandering a lot over the next half hour. Democrats insist Wisconsinites have been living under one for well over a decade, while Republicans claim the latest legislative maps signed into law earlier this year amount to a Democratic gerrymander. Before we unpack that debate, let's talk about what a gerrymander is and how it impacts you, the voter, at home. Gerrymandering is the process of purposefully changing the boundaries of legislative districts for political reasons, usually to give one party an advantage over the other. The word dates back to 1812, after the efforts to redraw legislative districts in Massachusetts, led by Governor Elbridge Gerry, resembled a salamander. Thus, gerrymander was born, first appearing as a satirical cartoon in the Boston Gazette. Enough with the history lesson. Every 10 years the census happens, giving mapmakers fresh population numbers to work with to make sure there's equal representation at all levels of government. How those maps are drawn varies by state. Wisconsin and 30-some other states rely on their state legislatures to do the work, passing political lines just like any other bill. We have maps for 8 U.S. congressional districts, 33 state Senate districts, and 99 state assembly districts, 3 for each Senate district. Gerrymandering happens in two ways. Cracking, where people with similar values, like party preference, are split up across districts to make electing their preferred candidates harder. Or packing, which is just the opposite, putting people with similar views into few districts as possible, giving them more power at the ballot box. No matter who draws the maps, there are some rules. The U.S. Constitution requires districts to have almost equal populations, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes sure minorities aren't discriminated from participating in politics. Wisconsin's constitution lays out 4 other rules. Districts should be compact, communities of interest where people have similar issues should stay together, districts should stick to county and city lines, and districts should be contiguous, meaning the lines are connected. No so-called Swiss cheese boundaries are allowed in the Badger State. The battle over these boundaries has been years in the making. Republicans drew the lines in 2011, and several court challenges by Democrats were unsuccessful. Until now, this all started to come to a head back in 2021. Governor Tony Evers vetoed the latest Republican-drawn maps, saying they amounted to gerrymandering 2.0. That led to more lawsuits. 2 years ago, the state Supreme Court had sided with Evers, only to reverse their decision after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the lines based on the Voting Rights Act. At the time, it was a victory for Republicans who had a decent shot at winning a veto-proof majority in the legislature. But just a year after all this unfolded, Democrats would get their victory, flipping the ideological balance of Wisconsin's Supreme Court for the first time in 15 years. With Justice Janet Protasewicz on the bench, a lawsuit was filed in August that ultimately led to a 4-3 ruling in December in favor of Democrats who argued that the GOP legislative maps were unconstitutional because districts weren't contiguous. About a month later, the state Senate passed new maps that they said were 99.7% of what the governor proposed. But a day after that, the Assembly following suit with all Republicans in support and all Democrats against. The governor would go on to veto these lines, calling them bastardized. He said they weren't really his maps because Republicans had scaled back the number of incumbents in their own party who would have to face each other in November. So on February 13th, it became a last-ditch effort as the Republican-controlled legislature passed exactly what the governor had proposed, with the hopes of avoiding court intervention that could be even less favorable to them. Less than a week later, the governor signed those new boundaries into law, but not everybody was happy. A lot of Democrats saw this as a too-good-to-be-true moment and questioned whether Republicans had a plan to take the battle to federal court instead. Unlike in 2020, when the maps were drawn a decade earlier, Republicans had control of both the Senate and Assembly, as well as the governor's office, giving the party total power over the process. Some Democrats say maintaining majorities got in the way of the goal: one person, one vote. That brings us to the arguments each side made before the court.
I think the impact is seismic, and we haven't had opportunities for both parties to compete in our maps for over a decade.
Dan Lenz is an attorney with Law Forward in Madison, a nonprofit with the stated goal of protecting democracy. Last August, just a day after Justice Janet Protasewicz was sworn into the state's high court, the firm challenged the existing GOP maps.
This case tested new questions about what our state constitution had to say, both initially about political gerrymandering and then also about the meaning of our contiguity provisions and how our districts are supposed to look.
Under a new liberal-leaning majority, the court agreed to hear the case. And while several claims were made, including a separation of powers violation, justices focused on contiguity, those detached pieces of territory.
The contiguity issue was the fig leaf to cover up what the court really wanted to do, which is a dramatic redraw of the state.
Luke Berg argues for the other side as an attorney with the conservative Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. He says even though there's a contiguity requirement and nobody disputes the existence of those disconnected pieces, previous state and federal court rulings have allowed those districts under certain circumstances, typically an effort to keep towns, cities, and villages with annexed pieces together.
Law Forward filed this new case, and one of their theories was, oh, we're changing our view on what contiguity means, and now we're saying that you can't actually have these islands, even though they had just taken the position 2 years ago that you could have these islands.
Folks have been challenging those maps more or less the whole time. It's not as though anything was new here. I mean, the questions that we raised with the court were novel, but I don't think anyone should have been surprised that there was going to be a challenge to these maps again.
Berg insists there was a simple fix of just absorbing or connecting those so-called islands to surrounding districts, which are oftentimes sparsely populated.
If you read the opinion, there's a single sentence in there where the court says, oh, the contiguity problems are so pervasive and in all the districts that it would be too complicated to resolve it by absorbing the islands, and that's just simply not true.
But Lenz says with more than half of Wisconsin's districts violating that basic rule, something had to be done.
In many ways, this is what our system is supposed to do. We're supposed to have, meeting of the minds, some sort of compromise. So we're very happy with that. The governor's maps are fair maps. That's what the consultants told us. That's what we have said.
In the end, Republicans who control the legislature gave in, but Berg says that's only because they were backed into a corner.
The governor's map was the least bad Democratic gerrymander, and so they just thought, let's adopt that because we might get a worse outcome if we keep going with the case.
You just heard why Republicans gave in, but how come Democrats weren't on board with the governor's plan? And with 99 Assembly and 16 Senate seats up in November, how does all of this impact lawmakers who want to keep their jobs? After the break, we'll ask them, hitting the road to find out what it means for Democrats and Republicans and why the door could be open for a lot of newcomers. Welcome back as we're spending this half hour on Spectrum News, making sense of what new maps could mean for voters all across Wisconsin. The latest political lines pair up a lot of current lawmakers against one another, some from the same party, others from the opposite. But that doesn't mean these legislators will actually face each other. Many have already announced retirement plans. Some are moving, others are running for another office altogether. Here's what the matchups look like under the new maps in the state assembly, according to WisPolitics. They've been keeping track of who's facing who. Based on the lines alone, there are a total of 15 pairs, with 11 of them being Republican on Republican, 3 Republican versus Democrat matchups, and just 1 Democrat against Democrat pairing. Over in the Senate, again according to WisPolitics, there are 13 incumbents making up 6 pairings. 4 Republican on Republican, 1 Republican on Democrat, and 1 Democrat on Democrat. And as you can see there on your screen, unlike in the Assembly, there are 3 incumbent lawmakers all paired together in 1 district under these new maps. With all those pairings, several state lawmakers will have some big decisions to make, including whether they want to run for re-election, possibly against another member of their own party, and even where if the new maps move them out of their current district. Wisconsin's residency laws say lawmakers don't need to live in a district to be a candidate. as long as they move by the time they take office. So depending on what incumbents decide, chances are we'll see a lot of primary races across the state come August. And as you might expect, the feelings about all of this depend on who you ask.
It's probably like getting our fingers cut off versus our neck cut off.
That's how State Representative Michael Schra of Oshkosh simply sums up why he and fellow Republicans voted in favor of political boundaries drawn by Wisconsin's Democratic governor. The move ultimately left Schra paired with another incumbent from his own party, and basically three choices.
You can retire, you can move out of your district into a different district, or you participate in a primary.
Not ready to retire, Schra decided he'll face his colleague, Rep. Nate Gustafson, an outcome that he doesn't take personal.
I guess if I would be my opponent that got drawn in by 15 feet, I might have those feelings, but I'm smack dab in the middle of the district.
Now the two will square off in an August primary, but Schra doesn't see that as a bad thing.
A primary is good for the district because especially when two people want to win really bad, they're going to do a lot of work. They're going to knock on a lot of doors, and it's only good for the district, in my opinion.
You're not going to hear me complain that my seat changed, and therefore something's harder for me. It's not my seat. The seat belongs to the people.
Other lawmakers were paired with an incumbent from the opposite party, like Representative Robin Vining.
I ran in a red seat, flipped it to a purple seat, won that, very clearly made it a blue seat.
The Wauwatosa Democrat says though more Republican pairings may seem unfair, it's simple math.
If you gerrymander yourself a near supermajority, you're going to have a lot of Republicans. That means if people end up drawn into the same district, they're very likely to be Republican and Republican. That's because you gave yourself so many seats.
If you look around the map, you can tell this is not an isolated incident.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
In the suburbs southwest of Milwaukee, State Senator Julian Bradley is about ready to wrap up his first term and run for a second.
He's done this to over 30 Republicans where he's matching them up and he's trying to eliminate the voice of the people to make the decision over who's going to represent them.
But to do that, Bradley is moving back into the district where he's already an incumbent, instead of facing the Republican he was paired against.
The governor's intentional gerrymander literally just separated me from the majority of my district. The majority of my district I've been elected to represent, and it's still intact. So I'm just moving to continue to give them the opportunity to decide whether or not I can represent them. We have an election coming up in November, and the people that hired me are the ones that are going to make that decision, not Tony Evers.
Unlike most of his party, Bradley voted against the governor's maps because he supported the original ones passed by Republicans that were later struck down by the state Supreme Court after the ideological balance flipped for the first time in 15 years.
I think it sets a dangerous precedent in the future that if you flip the court, you can change the maps. That's not in the Constitution.
Ungerrymandering the state may look like gerrymandering to some who have not been engaged so much as they are right now.
State Senator Jeff Smith has seen his district change before. It's why he moved office hours outside in the first place. Smith is paired against a Republican incumbent, but this time the new district is not only more compact, in his opinion, it's truly representative of the Chippewa Valley. He says Democrats voting against their own governor's maps came down to a bigger philosophy.
Let the courts decide this one and take it out of the hands of the legislature, because that's what we're ultimately trying to get to.
Unlike senators who live in even-numbered districts, whose seats are up now during the presidential election year, Smith won't have to worry about running until odd districts are up during the next gubernatorial election in 2026. But in the meantime, the new maps could help Democrats get closer to their goal of changing how those dividing lines are drawn.
We have a goal of still changing the system so that by 2031, we have a system that's out of the hands of the legislature and left in the hands of a nonpartisan commission who draws the maps and then presents it to the legislature.
Nonpartisan redistricting isn't a new idea. In fact, it's something Governor Tony Evers already tried to do. After the break, we'll tell you about that effort and the influence it had over these latest maps. That, along with a behind-the-scenes look at how legislative boundaries are drawn in the first place, and one Wisconsin professor's plans to take human bias out of the equation. Thanks for sticking with us as we spend this half hour trying to make sense of the new legislative maps in Wisconsin. We've talked about the legal battles and how state lawmakers are dealing with the dilemma in what's already shaping up to be a big election cycle. But where do these boundaries come from? How are they drawn in the first place? To answer those questions, we head to campus in Milwaukee, where one professor is taking people out of the process.
Right now, this district is within 86 people.
You could say Matthew Petering knows how to solve a complex problem as an engineering professor at UW-Milwaukee.
Okay, I'm going to lock it, close it off, and now let's move on to District 2.
This is how a professional mapmaker might use software to go about drawing political boundaries, but not Petering, who started developing an algorithm 5 years ago to do it for him instead. Sure, it's still a work in progress, but Petering is making strides, submitting a so-called friend of the court brief in the latest gerrymandering case decided by the state Supreme Court.
And I had mentioned that an algorithm, in my opinion, was less biased than a person, worked faster than a human, as well as created better maps.
But technology isn't taking over the whole process. Humans would still need to decide whether to adopt a map or present it to a court, whether good or bad.
It's like you're buying a home and you got 11 things you're keeping track of when you buy this home. You know, you want a good price, you want a good location, you want a great kitchen, you want a great upstairs, you want all this stuff, nice neighbors, a quiet area, a safe area, you know, and pretty soon you got so much to think about. There may be, it may be almost impossible to find really what you're looking for. So you got to make some trade-offs. And that's kind of the case with map making.
Petering's maps were disqualified early on because he wasn't a party to the case. But in the end, it didn't really matter, since the legislature passed maps and avoided court intervention altogether.
If you look at the Evers map compared to what we had, and you just look at all these criteria, I would say it's, you know, it's definitely a better map. I mean, from the point of view of all of these criteria looked at together.
Maps are living and breathing things. You know, there's not going to be one perfect map or one perfect set of maps.
Christopher Ford is the former chair of the People's Maps Commission, created by Governor Tony Evers back in 2020 as an attempt at nonpartisan redistricting in Wisconsin.
Each one of the maps, including the governor's maps that were signed into place, differ a bit from the maps that we drew.
The commission, handpicked by retired judges, spent a year drafting maps and taking submissions from almost 2,000 Wisconsinites across 68 counties.
The maps that we will get that are going to be the most fair are probably going to be the ones that either side of the coin don't feel as though they got a 100% win. And that is the idea that we were striving for.
Though the new maps aren't exactly what Ford and his fellow commissioners came up with, he still feels like they accomplished what they set out to do.
I think ultimately the goal that we set out to achieve as the People's Maps Commission was achieved, to give those individuals that opportunity to be represented and to give them the opportunity to move forward and to better their communities and to make the conditions better for their families and their loved ones.
Joining us now to help put all of this into perspective is Jeff Mayers. He's the president of WisPolitics.com. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Well, let's dive right into it. The question everybody wants an answer to: which party has better odds and in which chamber?
Well, I think the pundits seem to agree that Republicans will maintain control of both the Assembly and the Senate. If the Senate, all the Senate seats, all the 33 seats had been up, then it might be a different story because, you know, I think that a lot of those seats would be more in play. But, you know, the Democrats have such a long way to go in the Assembly. This is their best chance in this cycle. They have such a long way to go, though. They're down 64 to 35 seats. And Robin Vos, the Republican Assembly Speaker, the longest-serving speaker in Wisconsin history, predicts that they'll come up with 45 seats. So that really seems to be the agreement among the pundits that Republicans will have a narrower majority, but they'll still maintain the majority.
So with that in mind, would you say that supermajorities are out of the question?
Yes, I think that, right now the Republicans have a supermajority in the Senate and a near supermajority in the Assembly. But, the way these maps so drastically change the lines, you're going to have narrower majorities in each house.
So with that in mind, let's talk about what this means for policy going forward. What can we expect if we see more balanced houses?
Well, I mean, I think this is theoretical now. Okay, it's been a long time since we've had, narrower margins. I mean, Republicans have really dominated the legislature since 2011. So the hope, I think, from good government people and Governor Tony Evers is that there will be more reasonable policy, more compromise emerging from the legislature, even if it is controlled by one party. Some people say, though, that might not be the case because the Republicans will hold together more because they're, have smaller majorities. They're going to really, very few of them will stray. My personal belief is I think you'll have more representatives, more senators who are from swing seats and therefore not so much leaning to the extremes of either way. And I think that could lead to better policy.
Only time will tell, right? We'll
Yeah,
find out
that's
after
for sure.
November. Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We hope you've learned some helpful information over the last half hour. And don't forget, you can always visit myvote.wi.gov to see who's on your ballot for the August 13th primary. For all of us here at Spectrum News, I'm Anthony DaBruzzi. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. For more stories in your communities, click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV for the latest information, balanced coverage, weather updates every 10 minutes, and more. We'll see you then.